Hey, I'm Nick, the CEO and co-founder of an agency called Suits and Sandals. We specialize in brand communications, creative, and especially UX design. And I want to talk a little bit about a problem that we see all the time with companies that are in technical B2B spaces, especially technology companies that are expert led, particularly in like the startup or growth phase. And that is that the founder or the sort of core group of founders often have a really good grasp on the story of the business and how to sell to their target customers. They know why the company exists, what problems they solve, who it's best suited for, which parts of the story resonate during sales conversations. But we often go into meetings with those clients and ask, if I was to ask 10 people at your company to give me a 30-second elevator pitch, would I hear one consistent story or 10 different stories? We wouldn't necessarily expect to hear every employee to use the exact same words, but we would expect them to agree on that underlying story. And what we often hear is that no, there's a huge amount of inconsistency in how different people within the organization talk about the business. Um, for messaging purposes, we want people to broadly agree on what the company does, who it's for, what problems they solve, why it matters, why the company's different, and what evidence supports those claims. But we don't often see that. So, how can a company reach the point where the founders can explain the business perfectly, but the rest of the organization doesn't? And so, we're going to break down what the problem is, why it happens, what to do about it internally, and when it might make sense to work with an agency to kind of craft a better narrative and have the right tools in place so that way that narrative can be disseminated across the business and have everybody kind of operating on the same page. So, first, to talk about the problem. Often the founder has a strong intuitive narrative. They've got years of firsthand customer conversation experience, they've got a deep understanding of why the company was created, historical context behind the product or service, experience in seeing which explanations connect with the buyers, because they're often the ones that go into sales conversations at first. And they know things like which details to leave out, which proof points matter, which objections are likely to come up in the call, when to simplify, when to go deeper, and what finally causes the prospective customer to understand the value that you're bringing. The founder may believe that the company story is obvious because it's obvious to them, but what feels like a simple explanation may depend on years of accumulated context, technical expertise, their own personal charisma, the ability to answer follow-up questions easily, and an instinct for adapting the pitch to each listener that they've developed as they've spoken to lots of different target stakeholders within the organization that they're speaking to. So, what happens as the company scales? At the early stage, the founder handles most of the sales conversations in many cases, and they write or closely review most of the outward facing language that's used in marketing and sales. Employees can ask the founder directly when something is unclear, and inconsistency is manageable because the communication is centralized. When the team is small enough, they're kind of more directly involved. But as the company starts to grow, the founder is no longer present in all of these conversations, and salespeople begin to interpret the story for themselves. The marketing team develops its own language. The product teams will emphasize features and functionality. The recruiters emphasize mission and culture. Then there's a separate, story that's told to investors for the growth and marketing opportunity, or a market opportunity, I should say. Customer success teams explain the company through the existing customer needs. And each version may be reasonable in isolation, but the problem is that they may no longer be grounded in the same central narrative. You kind of develop this internal telephone game. The founder explains the company to the first few employees. Those employees explain it to later hires. New people learn by reviewing old decks, old proposals, website pages, maybe even recorded calls. And each person simplifies or adapts what they've learned and internalized. Older language will remain in circulation even after the business changes often. Especially with a growth stage company, you'll see this kind of evolution that happens as you pursue new customers and they provide you with feedback on your product. You make changes to that, and then all of those old materials may be slightly out of date. And eventually, the organization has multiple competing versions of the company story. It's not just a branding inconsistency, it actually creates real operational and commercial problems. And those problems in inconsistent messaging uh, creates other problems. One is that it takes prospects longer to understand the company. The website might tell one story, a salesperson tells a slightly different story. The product demonstration itself emphasizes something completely different. And the prospect has to kind of assemble the value proposition for themselves. Maybe they are really attracted to certain parts of it, but then it becomes hard for them to even, communicate that internally to stakeholders involved in the buying decision. And so the more work that a prospect has to do to understand the company, the easier it's going to be for them to disengage. And sales then becomes dependent on specific individuals. Usually the founder is really great at closing effectively. I mean, that's how they started the business oftentimes. Um, then one or two senior salespeople get involved, and they are very good at selling in the same way that the founder does, or a very similar way. But then as newer salespeople come on and there isn't sort of this central narrative that's really cohesive, they may struggle because they haven't internalized the same context. And leadership assumes the problem is that the problem with sales performance is with those salespeople rather than this knowledge transfer. And if the salespeople or the marketing team were provided with a better cohesive central narrative, then that story would stay consistent, and there'd be a much better conversion rate, essentially. Another issue is that the company may start to attract the wrong leads. When the story is unclear, prospective customers will form their own interpretation of what the company offers. And this can result in poor fit inquiries, incorrect expectations, price resistance, really long sales cycles, um, conversations where you're saying, well, that's not actually what we do. And things just become kind of fragmented. Different materials may emphasize different audiences or problems that you address, different product categories, different benefits, different differentiators. And so this makes each new marketing project a little bit more difficult because the team has to kind of renegotiate the company story every time. On top of that, internal decision making can often become more difficult. Messaging inconsistency will reveal a deeper lack of strategic alignment. Teams may disagree about the primary customer, the company's category, the most important use cases, what the company should be known for, which opportunities to pursue, which capabilities are central versus secondary. And on top of all of that, going back to the very beginning, the founder sort of becomes a communications bottleneck because they may feel that they have to review important copy, that salespeople need the founder to join key calls in order to like really hammer home and close the deal. Marketing may not be able to confidently approve the language, and it kind of results in almost this micromanagement of marketing as a result. And you'll find, especially with like expert led companies, those that need to be very precise about their language and things like that, the founder or even, the team in general, like the product team, especially saying things like, that's accurate, but it doesn't explain what we do effectively. Like certain parts of the story are right, but it needs to be massaged, and you get into this decision paralysis loop of wanting to make the content slightly different in the sales call, or on the web page or whatever, having to have these like super detailed, super precise headlines and copy that just prospects will get a little bit confused by, or it's so long that they don't read it all. And yeah, it just ultimately kind of falls apart. So the solution here is not to give everyone a memorized script. We're not trying to make people into a robot, right? We want to make sure that there's consistency, but we don't want it to feel too formulaic. And so, what that should actually look like is the objective is not identical wording. A salesperson, an engineer, a recruiter, a product leader, they're naturally going to emphasize different aspects of the company. And so some of those healthy variations might include a salesperson focusing on business outcomes, a product leader focusing on how the solution works, a recruiter focusing on the mission and culture, an executive focusing on the market opportunity. But all of these explanations should share the same strategic foundation. Everyone should broadly agree on who the company is primarily for, what problem or opportunity it addresses, what role the company plays in solving it, what outcomes it creates, what makes its approach meaningfully different, what evidence makes the story credible. The language can change, but the meaning should not. And so, if we're thinking about like the role of messaging versus something like sales scripts, a script tells employees exactly what to say. A messaging system will help them to understand which ideas matter most, how those ideas relate to one another, which claims can be made, what evidence supports those claims, how the story changes for different audiences. And the goal is to let employees communicate naturally without reinventing the company's positioning. So, what can a company do about it? Step one is to test the current level of alignment. You want to ask some people, depending on the size of your organization, maybe 5 to 10 people across the company, to answer a couple of questions independently. What does our company do? Who is it primarily for? What problem do we solve or problems? What is the most important value that we provide? Why would someone choose us instead of another option? What proof do we have that supports that claim? And how would you explain the company in 30 seconds? And spoiler alert, when clients work with us and we're in the process of developing a brand communications guideline and brand communication strategy, these are a lot of the questions that we ask in the first couple steps of alignment through a kind of a discovery phase before we put together what our recommended strategy would be. So you ask them all these questions and then compare the answers. Look beyond the wording and evaluate whether people actually agree on the underlying concepts. And this is a really useful exercise, even if there is disagreement, because finding out where there's alignment within your team or misalignment is super helpful. Pinpointing that misalignment can help to identify where to focus on to build alignment back up. Step two is to extract the founder's knowledge. If you're the founder, great. I don't know, interview yourself maybe, but interview the founder in depth. Don't ask for only the official elevator pitch. You want to explore how the company was originated, why customers initially bought in, how the offering has maybe changed over time, especially if you haven't been around since the beginning, what the founder says on successful sales calls. Maybe listen in to some of those successful sales calls or get old recordings. You want to know which misconceptions frequently arise, which parts of the story create an aha moment for the customer where they really lock in and get super excited, which customer outcomes matter the most, who the company or the product is not for, and why customers choose the company over alternatives. These are just a couple of areas to explore. Definitely, let the conversation flow, and you may pinpoint areas that are worth digging into further. The objective here is not to uncover the logic behind the founder's explanation. The objective is to uncover the logic behind the founder's explanation, not to simply transcribe the founder's preferred wording. Then step three is to test that story. A lot of times you have this idea of what the company is all about, what the product's all about. And when you actually dig into it with real customers, there are certain areas where things are slightly more attractive in other areas, or things are a little bit different in the way that the ideal customer understands it or interprets it. You want to treat it almost like a hypothesis that you're testing against. The founder's version is definitely important, but it should not automatically be treated as the final answer. So compare it with customer interviews, sales call patterns, win and loss information, customer success insights or testimonials, competitor positioning, your product strategy, and what are the company's actual business priorities. Sometimes the founder understands the company well, but emphasizes aspects that customers don't value as highly. So you really want to figure out what's going to be most important to who you're trying to sell to. And then from there, step four is to establish the core narrative. You want to define the primary audience, the central customer problem, the company's role, like your company's role, the core value proposition, meaningful differentiators, your supporting evidence, and the broader company narrative. How do you want to position your business? This is an important point, point in the process to resolve strategic disagreements before you start to polish the language. All of those misalignments that you found early on, especially within the sort of executive team and the decision makers behind this project, you want to make sure that everybody's on the same page about those core narrative components before you start to flesh out and polish your language. From there, step five is to create practical messaging tools that can be used across the organization. There's a bunch of different things you could do here, but a couple of examples would be a one sentence company description, a written out 30-second elevator pitch, a fuller company narrative that might be, a few paragraphs long and really tells the story of the business. You want to flesh out your audience personas, what their goals, challenges, frustrations, and motivations are, not just things like demographics and what position they have in the company and that kind of thing. And then from there, creating audience specific value propositions. How do you speak to each of those audiences? You might want to flesh out things like key differentiators, your proof points. Super important to have proof as to how you're different or how effective your product or service is. And really important here, common objections and responses. What do customers often say when they're challenging you or maybe frequently asked questions, and how do you respond to those things? It might also make sense to have written out customer or product or service descriptions that you can refer back to. A lot of times these are put together in things called sales battle cards. So like really, really brief, easy to digest, similar to a 30-second elevator pitch for your company, but instead for your product or service. And then really, really great to have would be examples of language to use and to avoid, what not to say, and what works really well. These tools should be easy to access. They should be usable, not buried in like a 100-page strategy document. It might be good to have that full strategy document so you have everything in one place, but breaking that out maybe into a wiki or a bunch of separate documents, presentation materials like different slideshows, things like that. Having each of those pieces easily accessible across your organization, super key. And then once you have all those materials, step six is to apply the story consistently. You really need to think about all of the places, all of the touch points that your customer has, and update those places where the company explains itself. So on your website, on your sales deck, proposals, your product demonstrations, investor presentations, recruiting materials, employee onboarding, even case studies, social profiles, conference materials, anywhere that's potentially a touch point to one of your audiences, which may be internal audiences, by the way. Um, it's a good idea to just think about how those fit. Do they currently reflect your central narrative? Are you telling a bunch of different stories? Where can you kind of clean things up and centralize? And yeah, that consistency is established through repeated application, not merely approving like a messaging document, a singular messaging document or something. You might have that, messaging strategy written up. You work with an agency or something to put together your messaging strategy, and you think it's like a one-time thing, and then you pass it off to the sales team, the marketing team, and they're just going to run with it. But it is something that does require sort of consistent checking and upkeep to make sure there isn't some drift over time. And along with that, you want to train the organization properly on how to use those messaging materials. Walk your employees, walk your team through why the narrative was chosen, what each part means, how it connects to different customer needs, how it should adapt for different audiences, and which concepts have to remain consistent even if there's a little bit of play, a little bit of flexibility in how you talk about things from one audience to another. People are going to be more likely to use your messaging correctly when they understand the reasoning behind it. So I think this part is much more important than a lot of companies give it credit. So definitely consider that. All right, so that's what you can do internally, and maybe a lot of that is doable internally. Maybe some of it seems a little bit overwhelming. You don't have a team big enough to put all that together. You don't have the expertise in house to get all of that done. So where can an agency help? And obviously, this is where I'm going to do a little bit of a soft pitch for myself. A company can absolutely work through all of this stuff internally, but the difficulty is that the people closest to the business often have the hardest time seeing where their story is unclear. So aside from having things like a lack of time or a lack of resources in house to get things done, you also want to consider the fact that if you're a little bit too close to the metal, it just becomes really difficult to explain things and not sound like a scientist or something. To translate your messaging from that really technical language, that expert led kind of language. You might have PhDs that are founders of the company, and they're used to talking in the jargon and in the lingo of the industry. But then you're selling to a CFO or somebody in procurement or somebody who's a little bit, a few steps away from the actual end user of the product. And that can be tricky. So if you bring in an outside agency, there's some objectivity that comes in. An agency can identify assumptions that insiders make and maybe no longer notice, language that makes sense internally, but maybe not externally, some contradictions between leadership perspectives, you know, either between different leaders within this organization or contradictions between how leaders think about things versus how it's getting disseminated or sold through marketing and sales. Maybe areas where company terminology can obscure customer value because it gets a little bit too branded or a little bit too complex, or even gaps between what the company says and what the customers actually value or the way that they interpret what you're saying. So, an agency can help to create a structured process, rather than just coming in and like maybe you have an internal workshop around your tagline. It's just like, okay, what should our tagline be? And you start to throw ideas out. Rather than just asking what should our tagline be, an agency would more systematically investigate business strategy, customer needs, competitive context. Again, going back to the founder's perspective and understanding that versus how audiences understand. versus how employees understand things, how the founder's perspective and the way that they talk about things compares to existing communications that are out there in the wild. And also, what are your sales and marketing performance, and how well is that existing communication actually working? And this then becomes the foundation for creating a messaging strategy. Um, you know, we can, or any agency, I suppose, can identify and facilitate the difficult decisions. Internal teams may disagree about the primary audience or which capabilities deserve emphasis, or whether the company is a product, a platform, a service company, or wanting to establish a category of its own, or something along those lines. Like, how do we actually sell ourselves? How do we fit? Are we considered a platform, or are we a digital product, or whatever it might be? Another thing might be that teams might disagree on is how specialized or broad the positioning should be, or maybe what should be excluded from the main story. And having an outside partner can really help leadership to evaluate those choices without being tied to a particular department's agenda. Then from there, an agency, especially like ours, can translate strategy into execution. A lot of agencies are more consulting firms that just focus on strategy, and they might put together a strategy document and go from there and just kind of hand it to you. And then it's up to you to figure out how to take that strategy and run with it. Other agencies might only focus on the execution, and they're really looking for you to provide the strategy. They might do some discovery and ask you a bunch of questions and just kind of run with whatever you're saying. But an agency like Suits and Sandals, we can then translate the strategy into the execution by creating things like a refined, refreshed, or even redesigned brand identity, a website UX strategy and creation of content, or redesign of website UX and UI, creating marketing collateral or sales and investor presentation material, developing out strategies specifically for product communications, coming up with marketing campaign ideas and execution of campaign creative assets, and also really importantly, something that I think gets overlooked a lot is internal tools and templates, things that actually activate your team to be able to utilize messaging to create your own marketing material, so that way you're not sort of stuck working with the agency and having to have them do everything for you. So with that said, working with an agency is obviously great, but there is some caution that you should take in regards to working with an agency. As I was saying before, sometimes agencies just come in and provide you with some materials, provide you with a strategy document, and that's it. That's one potential problem. So really evaluating how is that agency going to help you to grow past this issue. But also, something important to keep in mind is that a messaging engagement will not solve the problem that you're having if leadership is unwilling to make strategic choices, if every audience needs to be treated as equally important. Sometimes you need to have a primary audience and then some secondary audiences, or you need to diversify how you market or how you sell to different audiences. And so you have to put resources where they make the most sense. Other issues that may come up is you don't really want to change the underlying story, but you want to have like a fresh new way to tell that story. New words without changing the story and the strategy underneath may not really move the needle. Oftentimes as well, stakeholders will approve the messaging. They will approve the brand identity, the new brand guidelines, but then will continue to use their older preferred versions because it's easier to just use the old messaging, to use the old presentation because they don't want to take the time to learn or to adapt to the new strategies. And that's just never going to work. Uh, and yeah, another huge problem, honestly, is that the founder will continue to override the system in every situation. We've had situations in the past where we, design a whole brand identity. We put together a new presentation template, and the founder just prefers to do things their way and uses the old presentation template and, continues to be kind of in that micromanaging type of mindset of having to approve every single thing and not really going with the new strategy. You know you can't verify that that strategy is working without really giving it a full test and trying it out. So yeah, to go back through it, it's really important to understand uh, what your problem is when you're having this issue of not being able to effectively communicate your brand, or if things are kind of drifting. You start to notice that your website and your presentation materials are slightly different from what your actual brand position is or the way that you want to sell things. So really understanding how your like where your problem is coming from, going through that really deep discovery process is super important. And so if you were to go back and ask that question again, if you were to ask 10 people at your company to give an elevator pitch, would you hear one story or would you hear 10 unique stories? Going through this process of developing out a messaging strategy should get you to a place, especially if you're following through with the training and all that stuff, where, different words are fine. People might have slightly different ways of saying things, but that there are commonalities in the way that people are talking about it. Different strategic understandings are definitely a problem. But if everybody's on the same page about the strategic understandings, everybody's got the core messaging, the core ideas behind the messaging right, we're good. Keep in mind, again, remember, the founder's ability to tell the story is definitely valuable, but the company's not going to be able to scale if that story only works when the founder is in the room. The objective here is to turn an intuitive founder knowledge base into a clear, tested, adaptable communication system. A company has not truly clarified its story until the people throughout the organization can communicate it confidently and consistently. Uh, you know, in closing, I guess, your company's story should not be something that the founder has to personally deliver. It should be something that the entire organization understands well enough to carry forward. So, for companies facing this issue that we're talking about, this is exactly the kind of work that we help facilitate. Extracting what leadership knows, testing it against customers in the market, and then turning it into a story the entire organization can actually use. I hope this was helpful. I hope that you learned some things that you can put to use in putting together your own uh, messaging workshops and your own messaging strategies. But if you need some help putting those things together, or you want to rethink your brand, you want to put together a more solid communication strategy that can be communicated to a variety of different customer audiences, Suits and Sandals is happy to help. Suits and Sandals is happy to help. By the way, I'm posting this completely unedited, welcoming feedback here. This is going to be one of many little rants that I have about common problems that we see with the clients that we work with and what can be done about them. So definitely leave a comment. Let me know what you think. Like, share, hit the bell icon, all those things. And I'll catch you in the next one.